Earth's fury shook the stars. The Galactic Council learned too late. The chamber was cold enough to make my breath visible. I noticed that the moment I stepped off the transit pod and into the main concourse of Conclave Station, a place so enormous that clouds formed near the ceiling and drifted between the upper observation decks like slow thoughts. My name is Sarah Voss. I was 34 years old, and I had just become the first human being to walk through those doors as an official representative of Earth. No one looked at me. That was the first thing that struck me. Dozens of species moved through that concourse, tall ones, layered in ceremonial silk that shifted color when they breathed. Short ones that moved in coordinated clusters, their footsteps perfectly synchronized. One species that did not walk at all but drifted, their translucent bodies trailing thin wisps of bioluminescent vapor. Every one of them moved with the ease of people who had been here before, people who belonged here, people who had never once wondered whether they were welcome. I walked with my aide, a young man named Colin Hart, who was 26 and had the unfortunate habit of whispering his observations instead of keeping them internal. "That one's a Valanthe," he said, barely moving his lips. "The tall one, third-tier diplomatic robe. That's High Council access. I had already seen it. I had already noted the way the Valanthe glanced at us, not with hostility, which would have been something I could work with, but with the particular look of a person who notices a minor inconvenience and then promptly forgets it. We were categorized and dismissed in the span of a single breath. The Terran diplomatic suite was on the 42nd level, and I will say this for the Galactic Council's administrative team. They were thorough. The suite had been prepared with human-compatible atmospheric pressure, a gravity setting matched to Earth standard, and a meal tray that included what I can only describe as a sincere attempt at a sandwich. It was made of something that was not bread, filled with something that was not quite protein, but the intention was there, and I found that oddly moving. What was not moving was the orientation packet left on the main console. I read it standing up, because sitting down felt wrong for what I was reading. The Council had 12 founding species. It had over 4,000 years, admitted 31 more as full members. Species with voting rights, treaty access, and full military protections under the Conclave Charter. Earth had been admitted to none of those categories. We were listed under a classification called Provisional Member, which, according to the packet, meant we were entitled to attend open sessions, submit written petitions, and receive summary reports of any decisions that directly affected our home system. That was it. We could watch, we could write letters, we could read the summaries of decisions that had already been made without us. Colin read it over my shoulder and was, for once, silent. "They wrote this 14 months ago," I said, "before we even accepted the invitation." "So the invitation was never really an invitation. It was a notification," I said. "They were telling us we existed." I set the packet down and looked out the wide observation window at the sweep of stars beyond the station hull. Conclave Station sat at a gravitational midpoint between three star systems, chosen for its neutrality. From this window, I could see the long curve of a docking ring where ships from a dozen worlds sat in orderly rows. None of them were human ships. Earth had sent one vessel, a converted research craft called the Ardent, now reclassified as a diplomatic transport and repainted with the blue stripe of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. It looked, I thought, like a child's drawing next to the real thing. The first session I attended was 3 days after my arrival. The chamber was designed to hold representatives of all current member species simultaneously, and it did this through an architectural logic I still find remarkable. Concentric rings of elevated platforms, each one slight higher than the one before it, so that every delegate could see every other delegate, and no one sat above the center floor. The center floor was where speakers stood, where arguments were made, where the shape of the galaxy was quietly decided by people who had been deciding it for longer than humanity had known what stars were. I sat in the provisional section. There were 4 other species in the provisional section. I introduced myself to the nearest delegate, a being from a water-rich world called Theron, whose species communicated partly through color changes in their outer membrane. The translation device on my collar rendered their language into a dry, flat voice, but the words were clear enough. "How long have you been provisional?" I asked. 62 years, they said. I looked at them for a moment. "And before that?" "Before that, we did not exist, by the Council's definition." I sat with that answer for a long time. The session opened with administrative matters, shipping lane adjustments, a census report from a newly cataloged star cluster, a request from the Veth Collective regarding the reclassification of a disputed moon. The chair, a being named Councillor Oreth of the Drenali species, handled each item with the smooth efficiency of someone who had run 10,000 sessions before this one. No item took longer than 4 minutes. Decisions were made with small, precise gestures, and the lighting in the chamber shifted to confirm each outcome. Humanity had no vote. I raised my hand once, to indicate I had a question about a shipping lane adjustment that ran through a region of space where 2 Terran research stations sat. Counselor Orith noted my raised hand, looked at the provisional section for exactly 1 second, and moved to the next item. Colin, sitting behind me, placed hand on my shoulder. Not in sympathy. Then came the matter of the Solon. The Solon were a species I had read about in the briefing files. Small, quiet, primarily agricultural, living on 3 connected colony worlds in a system called the Irath Corridor. The Valanthe hegemony had been pressing territorial claims against the Irath Corridor for 11 years. The Solon had filed 37 petitions with the Galactic Council in that time, requesting mediation, requesting protection, requesting at minimum an official acknowledgement that their territory was recognized under Conclave Charter. The item took 6 minutes. A Valanthe delegate, not even a senior one, a mid-tier representative with a plain administrative robe, stood at the center floor and presented a document declaring the Irath Corridor a Valanthe administrative zone, effective immediately, on the grounds that the Solon had failed to register their colony system under the updated charter framework, introduced 9 years prior. The Solon delegates sat in the full member section and made a sound I did not need a translator to understand. The vote took 30 seconds. 12 of the founding species abstained. 14 full members approved the reclassification. 3 voted against it. The lighting shifted. The Irath Corridor became a Valanthe administrative zone, while I sat watching in the provisional section, unable to raise my hand, unable to speak, unable to do anything except memorize the faces of every delegate who looked at their console, and not at the Solon representative. I filed my report to Earth that evening from the encrypted terminal in my suite. I wrote it in plain language because I was too tired for diplomatic framing. The Council is not a governing body. It is an arrangement among the powerful to manage the less powerful. Earth has been admitted as a witness, not a participant. We have no vote, no voice, no protection, and no mechanism to obtain any of these things through the processes currently available to us. The Valanthe hegemony operates here with complete confidence because the Council's structure rewards the confident and costs nothing to the aggressive. I watched them take 3 inhabited worlds today. The paperwork was cleaner than the conscience of everyone who signed it. I want to be clear about what I am recommending. I am not recommending withdrawal. I am not recommending confrontation. I am recommending that Earth stop treating the invitation to this body as a sign of respect and start treating it as what it actually is, an opportunity to observe, to learn, and to prepare for the moment when observation is no longer sufficient. We are not welcome here, but we are here, and I intend to make the most of both of those facts. I sent the report and then sat for a while in the silence of the suite. Through the window, the Ardent was still there at the end of the docking ring, small and blue-striped and very, very far from home. Colin brought me coffee, real coffee, from a supply bag he had apparently smuggled onto the transport in a container labeled miscellaneous consumables. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I'm thinking," I said. "About what?" I looked at the stars. "About patience," I said. "About what it costs, and about what it eventually buys." He sat down across from me and wrapped both hands around his own cup and said nothing more. That was one of the things I valued most about Colin Hart. He understood when silence was the appropriate response to a situation that words could not yet fix. Somewhere on the other side of the galaxy, back on a small blue planet that the Galactic Council considered young and volatile and not quite ready for the real conversation, a project with no public name and no public budget was already 9 years into its work. I did not know its name yet, but I knew it existed, and sitting in that cold, beautiful, deeply indifferent station watching the stars turn, I was grateful for the first time that someone back home had been less patient than me. 3 years is not a long time in the life of a civilization. I know that now in a way I did not fully understand when I first arrived at Conclave Station. The elder species measured political time in centuries. A dispute that had lasted 400 years was considered, by the Drenali, to be in its early stages. The Valanthe hegemony had been absorbing neighboring systems for 600 years and described themselves as a young, expanding culture. 3 years to them was barely a morning. But to me, to all of us from Earth, three years was an enormous, heavy, grinding thing. I spent every day of those 3 years sitting in the provisional section of that chamber, watching decisions being made that affected human lives, filing petitions that were received with the precise courtesy reserved for paperwork, that would never be read, and writing reports home that grew, with each passing month, less diplomatic in tone. I had learned the station's rhythms by then. I knew which corridors were busy at which hours. I knew that the Drenali delegates ate precisely at the same time each day, and that the time immediately after their meal was when Councillor Orath was most likely to grant an informal audience. I had used that window twice, once to raise the question of human shipping lane access, and once to formally request a review of the provisional member classification criteria. Both times, Orath had listened with genuine attentiveness, and both times nothing had changed. Colin had been replaced, not by his choice. Earth's diplomatic corps rotated junior staff on 18-month cycles, and his replacement was a woman named Laura Holt, who was 28 and considerably more contained than Colin had been. She did not whisper her observations. She wrote them in a small notebook, old-fashioned paper, and shared them with me at the end of each session. I appreciated that about her. The Valanthi expansion had continued. Since the Irith Corridor annexation, 2 more independent systems had been reclassified as Valanthi administrative zones, and one had been absorbed entirely, its governance dissolved and its population registered as Valanthi subjects. Each time, the council vote had followed the same pattern: abstentions from the founding 12, approval from the aligned middle, a small cluster of opposing votes that changed nothing. I had stopped expecting the vote to change. What I had not stopped doing was paying attention to everything else. I noticed, for instance, that the Valanthi delegation had begun behaving differently in session. There was a confidence to them that had grown beyond the ordinary, institutional arrogance of a powerful species. They moved through the chamber the way people move through a room they own. They interrupted other delegates with increasing frequency and accepted corrections to this behavior with decreasing grace. Their senior representative, a figure named High Delegate Vrice, had recently begun arriving to sessions late and leaving early, as though the proceedings themselves were beneath his full attention. That kind of confidence, I had learned in 3 years of watching, came from certainty, and certainty came from knowing something others did not. The thing they knew, I suspected, was the new levy, the Council's Bureau of Developmental Affairs. A committee I had never been invited to address, had been working for 8 months on a new framework for what they called species economic contribution. The framework would require all provisional and developing members to contribute a percentage of their interstellar trade revenue to a common fund, which would be administered by a rotation of full member species. The rotation, as proposed, would begin with the Valanthi hegemony. It was in plain language a tax, levied on the species with no vote, administered by the species doing the levying. I filed a formal objection, which was logged, numbered, and shelved. Then came the month that I have never been able to think about without a particular weight settling in my chest. The Kepler 442b incident, as it was entered into the official council record, occurred on a Tuesday. I was in a session when the message came through on Laura's terminal. She leaned forward and put her hand near my arm without touching it. A signal we had developed for urgent, private information. I read the message under the table. A Terran deep space mining installation on Kepler 442b, a facility called Anchor Platform 7, which had been operating for 6 years under full Terran licensing, had been approached by 2 Valanthi border enforcement vessels. The vessels had transmitted a claim that the platform was operating in a disputed zone, despite the fact that the zone had never been formally listed as disputed in any council record we had been shown. The platform crew had responded according to protocol. They had identified themselves, provided their licensing documentation, and requested confirmation of the boundary claim. The Valanthi vessels had not responded to the confirmation request. 11,042 people had been working on that platform. I sat completely still for the rest of the session. I did not raise my hand. I did not speak. I watched Councillor Orath move through items on the agenda: a water rights dispute between 2 full-member species, a proposal to extend the docking ring on the station's eastern side, a recognition ceremony for a newly admitted species from the far spiral arm, and I felt something change inside me. Not break, change. The way metal changes when it is heated long enough, not weaker, but different in its essential structure, more fixed in its new shape. Laura wrote something in her notebook and slid it toward me. The message said, they filed for an investigation within 6 hours of the incident. The Council Bureau of Boundary Affairs has already accepted the filing. I wrote back, timeline for resolution? She wrote, standard preliminary review is 12 to 18 months. I looked at the word standard for a long time. The investigation concluded in 48 hours. I want to be precise about that number because I think it matters more than almost anything else I am going to tell you. 48 hours. A preliminary review that was described as standard and expected to take up to 18 months was completed in 48 hours. The findings, delivered by Bureau Chair Delegate Elas of the founding mural species, stated that the Volanthi vessels had acted within a legitimate boundary, ambiguity, that the incident was the result of a navigational misidentification, and that no corrective action was recommended. The 11,042 people on Anchor Platform 7 were referenced in the report as a collateral impact notation. Not names, not people. A notation. I walked out of the session before it formally closed, which was a significant breach of protocol. Laura followed me without a word. We walked back to the suite and I stood at the window for a long time, and I did not feel angry. I want to make that clear. Anger is hot and expansive and it dissipates. What I felt was cold and extremely precisely focused, the way a lens focuses light into a single burning point. I sent 2 messages that evening. The first was to Earth's diplomatic corps, a formal report using the correct language and the correct format, stating my concerns about the investigation's timeline and requesting a review of our provisional member status given the circumstances. The second was not a formal report. It was a direct, encrypted communication to a specific military address that Laura had quietly given me 3 weeks prior, during a conversation that neither of us had ever written down. The address belonged to General Orrin Mace of the Terran Defense Command. I had never communicated with General Mace directly. I had been told he existed. I had been told in careful, indirect language that he oversaw something whose name I did not yet know. That was all. I wrote to him simply, I understand the timetable has accelerated. I want to know what I can do from this position to make whatever you are building more effective. Tell me what you need. His response arrived 4 hours later, while I was trying to sleep. It said, keep attending the sessions, keep filing the objections, keep being seen as the patient diplomat who believes in the process. We need 6 more months. After that, your patience will have served its purpose. Thank you for what you have done so far. The people on that platform are not forgotten. I read that last line several times. Then I got up, made myself coffee from the small supply Laura had brought. She had apparently shared Colin's philosophy about miscellaneous consumables, and sat at the window until the stars shifted with the station's slow rotation. 6 months. I could do 6 months. I had learned the hard way what the council was. I had watched them vote away 3 inhabited systems. I had watched them erase 11,000 people with the language of navigational ambiguity. I had sat in a section designated for witnesses while decisions that would determine the course of human history were made by species who had decided, long ago, that humanity was not ready for the real conversation. Here is what none of them had taken the time to understand. We had been having the real conversation. We had been having it on Earth, in rooms they had never been invited to, in a language they did not know existed. We had been building something, not because we wanted to, because we had watched for 3 years how this galaxy worked, and we had understood, clearly and without any remaining ambiguity, that the only thing this galaxy respected was the capacity to be genuinely dangerous. We had been quiet for a long time. Quiet does not mean absent. I went back to the sessions the next morning. I sat in the provisional section. I filed my petitions. I wrote my reports. I smiled at Counselor Orath when he passed in the corridor, and he gave me the small, courteous nod that I had learned was the maximum acknowledgement he extended to provisional delegates. And I counted down the 6 months with the particular patience of someone who already knows how the story ends. General Mace had said the people on that platform were not forgotten. I believed him. More than that, I needed to believe him, because it was the only thing holding me to the discipline of continuing to sit in that chamber and watch and wait and say nothing when everything in me wanted to stand up and overturn the table. But I had learned something in 3 years that I had not fully understood before I arrived. The species in this chamber did not respect the people who overturned tables. They had seen that before. What they had never seen, what, I was beginning to understand, genuinely unsettled them about humanity, even when they were not saying so directly, was a species that could absorb this much, hold this much, and still show up the next morning with a straight spine and a pen and a notebook full of observations. That unsettled them more than they let on. Good. I wanted them unsettled. I wanted them to look at me across that chamber floor and feel the small, cold draft of something they could not quite name. The sensation of underestimating something that has not yet shown you what it is. 6 months. I would give them 6 months of patience. Then I would give them the truth. The morning the Council moved to reclassify Earth as a dependent protectorate, I wore the dress uniform of the Terran Diplomatic Corps for the first time since my initial arrival. Dark blue, with the gold thread of the senior envoy rank running along the collar. Laura had pressed it the night before without being asked. She understood the occasion without needing it explained. I had known this was coming for 11 days. The proposal had been submitted by the Bureau of Developmental Affairs in a standard filing that used so many layers of procedural language that a casual reader might have thought it was a maintenance schedule. But Laura had flagged it within an hour of it appearing in the shared registry, and I had read it 3 times before I fully accepted what I was reading. The reclassification would place Earth's solar system, all Terran colonies, and all registered Terran commercial and scientific operations under the administrative oversight of a newly created council sub-body called the Developmental Protectorate Authority. The authority's first appointed administrator would be selected from among full member species. The proposal named as the recommended candidate a senior official from the Valanthe hegemony. It meant that Earth, our home, our colonies, our ships, our people, our history, would be managed by the same species whose vessels had approached Anchor Platform 7 and left without answering. I spent those 11 days being very still. Laura and I reviewed every procedural rule in the Conclave Charter. We identified every formal mechanism available to a provisional member. We wrote in careful legal language a 14-page objection. We filed it. It was logged. It was numbered. I also sent a final message to General Mace. His reply was 2 sentences. We are ready. Do what you need to do. The session opened at the standard hour. The chamber filled. I walked to the provisional section and sat down. And then, for the first time in 3 years and 2 months, I stood back up. This was not protocol. Provisional delegates did not stand to speak. There was no mechanism for it. The session had not opened the floor to the provisional section. I simply stood. There was a pause in the room. A small, spreading stillness, like a stone dropped in still water. Several full-member delegates turned to look at me. Councillor Orith looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not quite surprise, because I do not think anything fully surprised him, but something close to it. An adjustment. Envoy Voss, he said. His voice carried the flat tone of someone maintaining authority through the act of naming, rather than through any actual instruction. I request permission to address the chamber, I said. My voice was steady. I had practiced being steady. Provisional delegates do not hold floor access during formal sessions. I am aware of the rule, I said. I am requesting an exception. There was a long pause. In that pause, I was aware of the specific quality of the attention in the room, not hostile, not sympathetic, but genuinely uncertain, which was something I had never felt directed at a human being in that chamber before. They did not know what I was going to do. That uncertainty, I realized, was itself something. Orith granted the exception. I think he was curious. I think, in his long career, curiosity had rarely led him wrong, and I think he looked at me standing there in that dress uniform and thought, let us hear what this has to say. I walked to the center floor. I had 4 minutes of prepared remarks. I had worked on them for 11 days, cutting and sharpening them the way you cut and sharpen a blade, removing everything that was not necessary, keeping only what would cut cleanest. I began with the Irith Corridor. I named the 3 colony worlds and the number of Solon individuals who had lived there when the council voted to reclassify their home as a Valanthe administrative zone. I gave the vote count. I noted the number of abstentions. I moved to the levies. I listed the specific percentage imposed on provisional member trade revenue. I named the administering body. I named the species that would administer it. I moved to Kepler 442b. I said the number clearly, 11,042 people. I said the 48-hour investigation timeline. I said the phrase collateral impact notation slowly, so there was no possibility of mishearing it. I listed 4 more incidents, smaller, less dramatic, but no less real, in which Terran interests had been dismissed, overridden, or simply ignored by a process we had been invited to witness but never to shape. Then I stopped listing. Earth entered this body in good faith. I said, we brought our best diplomat. We followed every rule. We filed every petition. We attended every session. We did all the things that provisional membership permits us to do. And we did them with the genuine belief that doing them well would eventually earn us the standing to do more. I paused. We were wrong to believe that. Not because the process failed, but because the process was never designed to succeed for us. This body is not a system for admitting new voices. It is a system for managing them. And the proposed reclassification of Earth as a dependent protectorate is simply the clearest expression yet of what this arrangement has always been. The chamber was very quiet. Earth is withdrawing from this body, I said. We leave the provisional membership effective as of this session. We will not be filing further petitions. We will not be attending further sessions. We will be communicating with the Galactic Council through different means. I let that land for a moment. I want to thank Counselor Orith for granting me the floor this morning. And I want to leave you with this. I looked around the chamber, at the founding 12, at the full member delegates, at the Valanthi High Delegate Vrace, who was sitting completely still with an expression I could not read. A message was transmitted from Terran Defense Command to this station approximately 40 minutes ago. You will have received it by the time this session closes. I recommend reading it carefully. I walked back to the provisional section. I picked up my things. Laura was already standing. We walked out of the chamber together without looking back. We were in the corridor, moving toward the transit pod when the station shook. Not violently, not like an explosion. It was a deep, resonant vibration that traveled through the floor, and up through the soles of my feet and into my spine. The kind of physical sensation that arrives before the mind has any framework to understand it. Several people in the corridor stopped walking. A Drenali delegate pressed both hands against the wall. A junior staff member from the Moral species looked up at the ceiling as though the answer might be written there. My communicator chimed. It was a text message from General Mace. It said only, Phase 1 confirmed. What had happened, I learned later in full detail, was this. A Valanthi military staging post in the Outer Rim, a facility that had been used to coordinate Valanthi expansion operations for the past 4 years, a facility that had been under Terran surveillance for 22 months, had ceased to exist. Not destroyed in any conventional sense, not blown apart, not burned, not reduced to debris that could be catalogued and analyzed. It simply was no longer there. The space it had occupied was empty, clean, as though the facility had never been built. What Earth had developed, in rooms the Council had never been invited to, in a language they had never heard, was a method of inducing localized gravitational collapse. A contained singularity event, precisely targeted, that compressed a defined volume of space to a point of total physical dissolution. No explosion, no shockwave, no wreckage, just absence. The vibration the station had felt was the gravitational echo of that event, traveling across hundreds of light years and arriving at Conclave Station as the faintest possible reminder that something significant had just happened to the shape of the universe. By the time Laura and I reached the Ardent and began the departure sequence, the Council's emergency channel was already active. Counselor Orith's voice was broadcasting across the station's communication system, calling all delegates to an emergency session, his tone carrying for the first time in 3 years something that was not smooth or efficient or precisely controlled. It carried urgency. I sat in the Ardent's command chair and watched Conclave Station grow smaller through the rear observation port. It was still extraordinary, still vast, still floating in the perfect geometric precision of its constructed neutrality. But it looked different to me now. Not smaller. Just less permanent than it had seemed the first day I arrived and walked through those doors, and nobody looked at me. Laura sat across from me with her notebook. Are you going to write something? I asked. She looked at the blank page for a moment. Then she closed the notebook. Not yet, she said. We were 3 hours into our transit when the Valanthi High Admiral transmitted the ultimatum to Earth. I received a copy through the diplomatic channel. It was formal, it was precise, and it was furious in the particular way that powerful people are furious when they are confronted with something they did not believe was possible. Humanity was given 72 hours to issue a full apology to the Galactic Council, submit to the Dependent Protectorate reclassification, surrender all unconventional weapon systems to Council oversight, and stand down any military posture currently in effect. In exchange, the Valanthi High Admiral offered to recommend leniency in the Council's response. I forwarded it to General Mace with a single added line. Your response, not mine. His reply came back within 20 minutes, and I read it twice, and both times I felt something I had not expected. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but a quiet, weary relief. The relief of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has finally been permitted to set it down. General Mace's response to the Valanthi High Admiral said, We have been waiting for you to say exactly that. We recommend you use the next 72 hours to have the conversation you should have had before you approached Anchor Platform 7. I looked out at the stars. We were going home. And behind us, for the first time in the history of humanity's relationship with the galaxy, something had shifted in the architecture of power. Quietly, permanently, and entirely on our terms. The Valanthi High Admiral's name was Dorith Vell, and he had commanded fleets for 31 years. I learned that from the intelligence file General Mace shared with me when I arrived back on Earth. I learned that he had overseen the expansion operations that absorbed the Irith corridor worlds. I learned that he had personally signed the authorization for the Kepler 442b boundary enforcement action. I learned that he had, 2 years before that, submitted a formal assessment to the Valanthi High Council describing humanity as a civilization with, and I am quoting the translated document precisely, insufficient developmental cohesion to represent a meaningful strategic consideration. I thought about that phrase a great deal during the 30 days that followed. Earth was not at war in the way that wars are usually described, with front lines and territorial advances and the kind of dramatic, large-scale engagements that make for clean historical narratives. What Earth did during those 30 days was far more difficult to describe and, I think, far more effective for being difficult. General Mace briefed me on the morning of day 2, in a room with no windows in the basement level of the Terran Defense Command facility outside Geneva. He was 57 years old, compact, unhurried, with the kind of face that had long since stopped advertising what it was thinking. He laid out the situation on a table-sized display and spoke for 40 minutes without notes. Earth had been building for 11 years. The decision to begin that building had been made quietly, without public announcement, by a group of 12 people who had collectively looked at the shape of the Galactic Council and arrived at the same conclusion I had arrived at in my first week on Conclave Station, that the Council was not a peacekeeping body, and that the only protection Earth would ever have was the protection Earth created for itself. What they had built was not, Mace explained, a conventional military. Earth did not have the population, the resources, or the manufacturing capacity to compete with the Valanthi hegemony in a direct, traditional engagement. The hegemony had 600 years of expansion, a fleet numbering in the thousands, and access to the raw materials of more than 40 absorbed systems. A conventional war would end quickly and badly. So Earth had not built a conventional military, it had built a doctrine. The doctrine had no official name in any public document. Within the command, it was called the Furnace Principle. It was based on 3 observations about how wars are actually won, drawn from 10,000 years of human military history, a resource no other species in the Galactic Council could access, because no other species had been at war as continuously, as creatively, or as desperately as humanity had been with itself across the span of its own history. The first observation: a smaller force can defeat a larger one if it denies the larger force the ability to use its size. Control the terrain, control the timing, control the information, and size becomes a liability rather than an advantage. The second observation: psychological pressure is a force multiplier. An enemy that is confused, uncertain, and unable to predict what comes next makes worse decisions than an enemy that is simply being shot at. The third observation: attrition, sustained long enough, breaks even the most powerful opponent, if the smaller force is willing to sustain it. And humanity, Mace said, looking at me across that table with an expression that was matter-of-fact and not remotely boastful, had a documented historical capacity for sustaining loss that most species found, when they learned about it, genuinely disturbing. They think stubbornness is a character trait, he said. We know it's a survival mechanism. The first 7 days were devoted to what Mace called resource denial. Earth's automated platforms, small, independently powered, essentially impossible to detect at distance, had been pre-positioned across 14 key transit corridors used by Valanthi commercial and military shipping. On day 1 of operations, those platforms activated. They did not destroy the ships passing through those corridors. They disrupted them, jamming navigation, interfering with jump drive calibration, creating the constant, grinding uncertainty of travel that functions without full reliability. Within 4 days, Valanthi commercial shipping through those corridors had dropped by 60%. Not because Earth had destroyed anything, because the Valanthi captains and their insurers had decided that the risk of transit was no longer acceptable. The hegemony's economy was deeply dependent on those corridors. 6 of the 14 were primary supply routes for their military expansion. Operations. Within the first week, 3 Valanthi forward bases began reporting supply shortages. On day 8, the Valanthi deployed a fleet. 260 warships, a number that was meant to be overwhelming and would have been, against a conventional opponent. They sent it to the primary human colony system to demonstrate that Earth's posture was unsustainable. What they found was not a fleet. What they found was an empty system. The colonists had been evacuated 2 weeks prior. The installations they found were intact and fully powered. Because abandoning installations completely would have told the Valanthi fleet too much. about Earth's intentions. But the systems were running on automation, and every corridor into that system was seeded with the same navigation, disruption platforms, and the fleet spent 4 days moving carefully through a system that offered them no resistance and no target and no clarity about where the actual opposition was. Meanwhile, on day 9, a Valanthi military logistics hub 3 systems away was subjected to a second, gravitational collapse event. This one was smaller than the first, more precise, targeted at a single structure rather than an entire facility. The Valanthi lost their primary ammunition processing center for that sector of operations. Day 9 was also the Day 2 Council species formally requested an emergency trade consultation with Earth. I handled those consultations by communicator from Geneva. The species requesting consultation were the Theron, the same beings I had met in the provisional section on my first day at Conclave Station, who had been provisional members for 62 years, and the Veth Collective, a mid-sized member species whose economy was heavily integrated with the Valanthi trade network, and who had voted in favor of the Kepler 442b finding. The Theron consultation was straightforward. They wanted to know if Earth intended to harm them. I told them we had never had any intention of harming them, that our quarrel was specifically with the Valanthi hegemony and with the Council, structure that had permitted the hegemony to operate without accountability, and that we would welcome a conversation about how the Council might be reformed in a way that gave actual protection to species like the Theron, who had been waiting 62 years to be heard. That conversation lasted 3 hours. It was the most productive diplomatic conversation I had in 4 years of trying. The Veth Collective consultation was less comfortable. Their representative, a senior delegate named Councillor Arun, who had the kind of careful, polished manner that comes from decades of very expensive political survival, wanted to discuss the economic impact of the transit disruptions on Veth commercial operations. I said, "We understand the disruptions are significant. We want to help you understand why they are happening." Arun said, "We understand why they are happening. We are asking when they will stop," I said, "when the structural conditions that made them necessary no longer exist." There was a pause. Arun was a skilled enough diplomat to understand what that meant, without requiring it to be explained further. "The Council," he said carefully, "is already discussing structural reform." "I know," I said. "I hope the discussion goes well." On day 14, the Valanthi fleet that had been holding position in the evacuated colony system finally withdrew. They had found nothing to engage. Their supply situation was worsening. 2 of their senior admirals had submitted formal assessments to High Admiral Doroth Vell describing the engagement environment as operationally unprecedented and recommending a strategic reassessment. Doroth Vell's response to his admirals, which our intelligence services intercepted and translated, was to replace both of them and order an advance on Earth directly. The advance never reached Earth. It did not fail because Earth destroyed it. It failed because, on day 17, the Terran Defense Command transmitted a message to every ship in that fleet individually. Not to the Fleet Command, not to Doroth Vell, but to every individual vessel in the Valanthi language, signed with coordinates. The message described, precisely and in accurate technical detail, the gravitational collapse system. It explained how it worked. It explained the targeting parameters. And it included the current targeting coordinates for Doroth Vell's flagship. No ship in that fleet received a follow-up message. No ship needed one. By day 18, 60% of the fleet had independently changed course. By day 22, the advance had dissolved entirely. Not because of orders from above. Doroth Vell had not given the order to withdraw, but because 260 individual captains had made 260 individual decisions that the same conclusion was correct. That was the moment, I think, when the nature of the engagement fundamentally changed. Not the gravitational weapons, not the transit disruptions. The moment when 260 Valanthi captains, trained professionals, experienced warriors, beings who had served a dominant military power their entire careers, decided one by one that the math did not work in their favor. That was the furnace principle operating at full effect. On day 28, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session. Not an ordinary emergency session, a special convening that had only been called twice in the Council's 4,000-year history, reserved for situations the Charter defined as threatening the structural integrity of the conclave itself. Councillor Orath transmitted an invitation to Earth's diplomatic corps. The invitation was formal, courteous, and notably different in tone from anything I had received in 3 years of attending regular sessions. It addressed me as Senior Envoy Voss, not provisional delegate. Not the human representative. I accepted. Laura packed the notebook on day 30. I walked back into the chamber at Conclave Station. And this time I was not alone. Behind me were two Terran Defense Command officers, Lieutenant Commander Patrick Webb and Major Grace Ainsley, in full military dress, standing with the specific, relaxed attentiveness of people who are professionally comfortable with being the most dangerous individuals in any given room. I sat in the center floor, not the provisional section, the center floor where speakers stood, where arguments were made. No one asked me to move. Counselor Oreth called the session to order, and then he looked at me, and for the first time in 4 years, his expression was entirely unreadable. "Envoy Voss," he said, "the council is prepared to hear Earth's terms." And I thought of the Solon delegate making that sound I had not needed a translator to understand. I thought of the vote that took 30 seconds. I thought of the lighting shifting in confirmation. I thought of 11,042 people and a 48-hour investigation, and the phrase collateral impact notation. I opened the folder on the table in front of me. "Then let us begin," I said. "There is a particular quality to silence in a large chamber when the people filling it are waiting to hear something they know will matter. I have spoken in many rooms in my life, lecture halls, diplomatic briefings, city council chambers on 3 different continents on Earth, the conclave floor itself in the years before any of this. But I have never experienced silence quite like the one that greeted me on the morning. Began reading Earth's terms to the Galactic Council. They were not gentle terms. I want to be clear about that. I had spent 4 years watching what gentleness produced in this chamber, and I was done confusing courtesy with strategy. The terms I read were precise, structured, and entirely non-negotiable, which is a phrase that diplomats use sparingly because it removes the illusion that both sides are participating equally in an outcome. I used it deliberately. The first term, the Valanthi hegemony, would be dissolved as a governing body. Its member worlds, the systems it had absorbed, the colonies it had annexed, the populations it had reclassified as Valanthi subjects, would each be given the immediate right of self-determination, administered by a neutral council commission to be formed within 90 days. I watched High Delegate Vrace across the chamber when I read that term. He was a composed person. He had been composed for the entire crisis, and I had respected that even while opposing everything he represented. He stayed composed when I read the first term. But his hands, resting on the table in front of him, shifted position. A small movement, almost nothing. The second term, the provisional member classification would be abolished from the conclave charter entirely. All species currently holding provisional status would be elevated to full voting membership within 60 days. Criteria for future membership would be rewritten by a committee that included equal representation from current provisional and full member species. Murmuring in the chamber. Not loud. The contained, restrained sound of people who were accustomed to controlling their reactions but were finding the effort more costly than usual. The third term, the Bureau of Developmental Affairs and the concept of species development levies would be permanently dissolved. All revenue collected under that framework from provisional member species over the preceding 40 years would be returned, with calculated interest, by the full member species that had administered the fund. That was the term that broke the composure of 2 delegates in the founding 12. I will not name them. Their reaction was brief, and they recovered quickly, and I do not think it serves anything to catalog the precise moment when someone's dignity costs them more than they expected. The fourth term, a permanent independent accountability commission, with equal representation from all member species regardless of size or seniority, would be established to review all military and territorial actions taken by any member species. The Commission's findings would be binding. Abstention in votes on Commission findings would be counted as a yes vote on the action under review, eliminating the mechanism by which the founding 12 had consistently avoided accountability by saying nothing. Counselor Oreth looked at me when I read that term. I looked back. The fifth term was the one about Dorothy Vell. I read it simply. High Admiral Dorothy Vell would stand before the new Accountability Commission and answer for the authorization of the Kepler 442b boundary enforcement action. The Commission would determine appropriate consequence. Earth would not specify the outcome. That was the Commission's function. But the appearance before the Commission was not optional and was not subject to Valanthi political protection. I closed the folder. The chamber was silent. Counselor Oreth said, "Envoy Voss, are these terms presented as the full extent of Earth's requirements?" "They are," I said. "And if the Council declines to accept them, then the Council and I will discover together what the next phase of the furnace principle looks like. I would prefer we did not discover that. I believe you would prefer that as well. Another silence. Orith said. The council will need time to consider. You have 72 hours, I said. We extended the same courtesy to High Admiral Vel. It seems appropriate. That produced something I had not expected and would not soon forget. 3 of the founding 12 species, the Theron who had been provisional for 62 years, the Veth Collective, and a founding species called the Moral who had opposed the Kepler 42b finding, began a quiet, contained sound that I recognized after a moment as laughter. Not cruel laughter, not triumphant laughter. The laughter of people who had been waiting a very long time for someone to make that particular point in that particular room. The council accepted the terms in 61 hours. Vrace tendered the Valanthe Hegemony's dissolution agreement personally. He came to the temporary Earth delegation office on the station. A real office now, not the 42nd level suite, and he sat across from me and he placed the document on the table and he was quiet for a moment before he spoke. You should know, he said, that I never considered you a threat. I know, I said. That was the mistake. Yes, I said, it was. He left without another word. I will say this about him. He was honest, in the end. That is more than I expected and more than he owed me. The months that followed were not simple. Dissolving the hegemony was an enormous, complicated, frequently contentious process. 27 worlds needed self-determination frameworks. Population registries had to be reviewed. Economic dependencies that had been woven through the Valanthe administrative structure for decades had to be untangled carefully enough that the untangling did not cause more harm than the system it was replacing. I was appointed Earth's primary representative to the Restructuring Commission, which meant I spent the next 18 months doing something that felt, at the time, less dramatic than the events preceding it but was arguably more important. The hard, slow, detailed work of building something better than what had existed before. Laura was with me for the first 6 months of that work. Then she took a posting as Earth's first permanent ambassador to the Theron, which was, I told her, exactly the right job for someone who had spent years learning to say important things in a small notebook without ever needing to raise her voice. Patrick Webb and Grace Ainsley stayed on as my security detail for the full 18 months. Webb had a habit of noting, every few weeks, that he had never actually had to do anything in that role. I told him that was the point. That looking like someone worth protecting was, in itself, a form of protection. He considered that for a while and eventually agreed that it was probably true. General Mace retired 14 months after the resolution. He sent me a message when he did, short and characteristic. It said, "The building is done. Someone else can live in it now. Take care of yourself, Envoy." I kept that message. Dorith Vel appeared before the Accountability Commission in the 7th month. I was not present for the proceedings. They were conducted by the Commission, and it would have been inappropriate for me to attend. The findings took 3 weeks to compile. When they were published, they concluded that the Kepler 442b action had been undertaken in knowing violation of territorial boundaries that had never been legitimately disputed, and that the authorization of the action constituted a deliberate use of force against an unprotected civilian installation. The recommended consequence was the removal of Dorith Vel from any military or governmental position for the remainder of his life, a formal public acknowledgement of responsibility, and a designated memorial contribution to the families of the 11,042. He issued the acknowledgement in writing. It was 4 sentences long and contained, in its final sentence, the word inexcusable. I read it once. Then I put it away. On the day I was formally appointed chair of the reformed Galactic Council, the first human being ever to hold a founding level position in the body, and the youngest chair in its history by approximately 3 centuries, I stood in the center floor of that same chamber, where I had once sat in the provisional section and watched the lights change color to confirm decisions made without me. The chamber was full. Not just full members and former provisional delegates and the new independent worlds being welcomed for the first time to the table where their fates were discussed. It was full of every kind of being this galaxy had produced across billions of years of evolution, tall and small, luminous and opaque, sound-speaking and color-shifting and silent in ways that meant more than words. I looked at all of them. I thought about the first day I had walked into the concourse of this station and nobody had looked at me. I thought about the orientation packet, with its careful language about witnesses who could write petitions. I thought about the Solon delegate. I thought about Laura's notebook. I thought about 11,042 people and a 48-hour investigation. I thought about General Mace saying, "The people on that platform are not forgotten." I accepted the chair, not with pride. I want to be precise about that. Not with triumph. with the specific, clear-eyed weight of someone who understands what the acceptance commits them to, not just for the months ahead, but for the years, the decades, the work that does not end because a crisis ends. The galaxy is not fixed. What we built here is not permanent by nature. It is permanent only if people keep choosing to defend it, which means it requires constant tending, constant honesty, and the constant willingness to be uncomfortable in the service of something true. Humanity knows how to do that. We have been doing it for as long as we have existed. Not because we are noble, we are not, reliably or consistently. Not because we are always right, we are demonstrably not. But because we have this particular, stubborn, sometimes maddening quality of refusing to accept a world that we can see is worse than it needs to be. I gave a speech from the chair that first day. It was 11 minutes long, and I will not reproduce it here. But there is one thing I said that I want to be precise about, because I think it matters more than the policy language and the reform frameworks, and the carefully negotiated terms that had brought everyone to this room. I said, Earth did not want this. We did not come to this galaxy looking for a fight. We came to this galaxy because we are the kind of species that looks up at the stars and feels the pull toward them so strongly that we built machines to carry us there before we had solved half the problems on our own world. We came because we are curious and restless, and we believe, perhaps irrationally, that the universe is large enough for every kind of being to exist in it with dignity. We brought our fury here because you left us no other choice, not because we wanted to, because the only alternative was to become, slowly and quietly, the kind of people who watch injustice from the provisional section and write petitions and say nothing when the lights change, color to confirm the wrong answer. And we are many things. We are complicated and contradictory, and we carry our history in us the way all living things carry theirs. But we are not that. We are not people who stay quiet when staying quiet is the same as saying yes. So here we are. They thought our fury was our weakness, that we could not sustain it, could not aim it, could not survive it. They looked at our planet, young, they said, volatile, they said, and they saw something that needed to be managed rather than heard. They drew a boundary around us and called it care. They built a category for us and called it membership. They did not ask what we had already built. They did not wonder what was waiting quietly in the spaces they had never thought to look. They learned. I intend to make sure they never forget. And I intend to build something here, in this chamber, with every species that fills these seats. That means no other civilization ever has to learn the same way we did. By sitting in a section designated for witnesses while their home was decided without them. The stars are large enough for all of us. We are here to prove it.